Undercover CEO walks into his own store and finds a cashier in tears, but what follows is worse. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great stories like this. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The ones who do the work don't get the tips. The one who gets them is the manager's nephew. She said it like it was normal, like she'd repeated it to herself so many times it had lost its edge. But for the man standing in line that morning, it was anything but normal. Jackson Cole, 51, founder and CEO of Horizon Retail Group, was standing right there, disguised as a weary traveler with a faded gray hoodie and a baseball cap pulled low. And what he heard at that register would change everything. He watched the cashier barely mid-20 seconds, apron neatly tied but sleeves frayed, wipe at her cheek with the back of her hand before sliding another receipt across the counter. The customer didn't notice. No one ever noticed. The neon "open" sign buzzed faintly overhead, its light flickering like it was tired of holding on. Jackson said nothing at first. He just shifted the small pack of gum in his palm, pretending to check the rack of impulse buys beside the register. But his eyes stayed locked on the detail others ignored. The tip jar, clear plastic, nearly empty. A couple of dollar bills crumpled inside, coins clinking against the bottom. And yet, he had just seen a customer add a tip on the card machine. It hadn't gone in the jar. It had gone somewhere else. The cashier's voice dropped lower, just under the hum of the old fluorescent lights. Morning shifts. They're the worst for tips, especially when you're not on the list. Jackson tilted his head slightly, feigning confusion. What list? She hesitated. A flash of fear crossed her face, quickly masked with a brittle smile. Doesn't matter. It's just the way things are here. But Jackson knew better. He'd heard that tone before in boardrooms, in warehouses, in the whispered corners of his own empire. It wasn't laziness. It wasn't even defeat. It was something colder, survival in silence. He slipped a worn notebook from his pocket. Nothing fancy, just a thin pad with dog-eared corners. He'd carried it for years, jotting down numbers, names, odd details that didn't fit. And now, with a few quiet questions and a simple observation, another investigation had begun. Outside, drizzle streaked the windows, soft enough to blur the world beyond. Inside, time slowed. The line moved, customers chatted, but Jackson's focus never left the cashier. Every detail added weight. The crack in her voice, the way she avoided the POS terminal, the flicker of her eyes whenever the manager's office door creaked open. This wasn't about one bad shift. It was a system, and someone had designed it to stay hidden. Jackson didn't speak again. Not yet. He picked up his receipt, tucked it into his pocket, and left his gum on the counter untouched. The transaction was small, almost invisible. But in his mind, the entire store had just been placed under audit. Because behind the tears of one cashier, Jackson had just seen the first crack in a structure that was supposed to hold. And cracks always spread. Jackson didn't rush out of the store that morning. He lingered in the parking lot, rain tapping softly against his windshield, watching through the glass. The neon "open" sign still hummed, and behind it the staff moved with a rhythm that told a story no dashboard could. On paper, this store looked fine. Better than fine. Revenue targets had been exceeded 3 quarters in a row. But the turnover rate here was the highest in the district, and employee engagement had flatlined. Numbers didn't cry, but people did. And the tears he had just witnessed were worth more than any quarterly report. From his driver's seat, Jackson studied the early shift crew. It wasn't exhaustion he saw. It wasn't even carelessness. It was detachment. Every motion felt mechanical, like they weren't working for pride anymore, but for survival. He remembered something he used to say when training his first managers a decade ago. If you want to know if a store is healthy, don't ask the GM. Watch how the staff greets customers at 7 a.m. Today, that theory was being tested. Jackson pulled the hood lower, stepped back out into the drizzle, and re-entered quietly. The bell above the door jingled faintly. No one looked up. No greeting. Only the soft scrape of shoes against tile and the steady beeping of the register. He slid into a booth in the corner, a seat with good sight lines but low visibility. From here, he could watch without being watched. That's when he noticed her again, the cashier. She moved with a kind of intentional grace, balancing trays, refilling cups, folding napkins behind her back without skipping a beat. She wasn't faster than the others, she wasn't louder, but she was present, engaged, even as her eyes carried the weight of something unfair. And then Jackson noticed the others. A young man with slicked-back hair and a spotless uniform lingered near the POS terminal. Another, slightly older, leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Neither carried trays. Neither spoke to customers unless they were handling payments. Every tip passed through that screen, and nearly all the morning transactions went through them. Jackson's jaw tightened. He didn't react outwardly, just lifted the cup of black coffee he had ordered and let the bitterness settle on his tongue. His eyes tracked every move. Every detail matched the crack he had already seen. Something here wasn't broken by accident. Someone had rewritten the rules. Jackson sat in the corner booth, hands wrapped loosely around the chipped mug of black coffee. The steam had already thinned into the air, leaving only the sharp bitterness. His eyes never left the register. Customers came and went. Tips were added on card transactions. But the cashier, the same young woman he had seen crying earlier, never once touched the POS terminal. Every single payment was routed through the two men lingering near it. One with slicked-back hair, the other slightly older, standing just close enough to control the flow. They weren't working the floor. They were working the system. When she passed his table again, Jackson kept his voice casual. "Why don't you swipe the payments yourself?" She didn't stop moving, didn't even glance at him. But as she leaned in to clear a plate, her voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't have access. The system locks me out." Jackson's brow tightened. "Locks you out?" "POS only allows certain roles to process payments," she explained softly. "If your name isn't assigned, you don't get the digital tips. I'm listed as supplemental staff. That's the invisible list." Jackson followed her subtle nod toward the counter. Behind it, the store manager leaned against the back wall, laughing with a regular, clean shirt, polished smile, posture that screamed confidence. On the surface, he looked like the model of competence. But in that moment, Jackson saw something else. A man who had built a private gate around money that didn't belong to him. The cashier returned with a tray, but instead of leaving right away, she hesitated. Her hand dipped into the pocket of her apron and came back holding a thin notebook. The cover was worn, corners bent, edges soft from use. She placed it on the table as if it were something fragile. "I didn't want to complain," she said quietly. "I just needed to know I wasn't crazy. So, I started writing it down." Jackson opened it carefully. Each page was filled with handwritten entries, dates, table numbers, bill totals, the tip displayed on the POS, and the tip she actually received. Red circles marked the discrepancies. In the margins, small notes, timestamps, initials. It wasn't a complaint, it was evidence. She watched his face as he flipped a page, her voice barely audible. "I've lost more than $600 in the last month. But what hurts more is no one ever asked who decides or how." Jackson closed the notebook gently, sliding it back toward her. He didn't say much, just a quiet nod. But inside, something had shifted. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. Someone had designed the system to make her invisible. He took another sip of the coffee, now cold, but the bitterness didn't come from the cup. It came from what he had just read. At that exact moment, his attention snapped back to the counter. The younger employee with the slicked hair tapped the POS screen, moving through menus with a rhythm that didn't belong to a part-time server. For a second, the angle of the screen gave Jackson a glimpse. User role settings, access level, advanced. Username, Tyler C. His grip tightened around the mug. He had seen enough. This wasn't just about missing tips. It was about control. It was about creating layers of privilege inside a process that was supposed to be fair. As the cashier returned to the floor, balancing another tray, Jackson slipped his phone discreetly from his pocket. He angled it low, snapping quick photos of the notebook pages while her back was turned. Every red circle, every margin note, every discrepancy captured. Then he pulled a sticky note from his wallet, scribbling a single line in block letters. "Keep documenting. Don't give this to anyone else. Wait for me." He tucked the note into the notebook and slid it back under her tray just as the manager disappeared into the back office. For the rest of the shift, Jackson sat still, silent. He didn't need to say more. The evidence was already in motion, and the investigation had begun. Because what he had in front of him wasn't just a notebook. It was a map, one that pointed straight to the truth. Jackson left the store that afternoon without looking back. To anyone watching, he was just another man in a gray hoodie, slipping quietly into the drizzle. But inside him, a storm had already started. By the time he reached his car, the notebook's pages were already saved on his phone. Dates, totals, red circles, all preserved. Evidence wasn't enough to change a system, but it was enough to spark one. He opened his contacts and pressed a name he rarely used in public. "Mara," he said when the line connected, his voice low, steady. "We have a problem. The POS system at Branch 17 is being manipulated. I need you to go in quiet, line by line, every role assignment, every tip account." On the other end, there was no hesitation. Mara Lynn, head of internal investigations for Horizon Retail, had dismantled 3 major fraud schemes in the past 4 years. She asked no questions. She only said, "Understood." Within the hour, Branch 17's POS terminal was placed into silent audit mode. The system looked normal to the staff, but every keystroke, every override, every role change was now being recorded in the background. The diner would function as usual, but the walls were closing in from the inside. The first findings arrived the next morning. Finding number 1, a hidden access tier labeled Preferred Internal. It didn't show up on the public-facing staff permissions, but it had been applied to 3 accounts: Brad Coleman, store manager; Tyler C., part-time server; an unassigned account labeled Kitchen Support 03. Finding number 2. In the past 30 days, digital tips totaled over $4,800. Of that, 67% had been routed through Tyler C. His service volume accounted for less than 15% of tables. The math didn't just look wrong, it was engineered. Finding number 3. Payroll records listed a part-time kitchen worker named Marcus Hill, clocked in for 21 of the past 25 mornings. But HR had no onboarding file, no tax documents, no valid ID. His social security number had already been flagged for duplication at another branch 2 years ago under the same manager. That investigation had collapsed back then for lack of proof. This time, the proof was stacking. The final detail came from finance. A shell entity called Douglas Henderson LLC had been receiving small service processing fees every Friday, amounts that matched the missing tip differentials almost to the dollar. On paper, it looked like outsourcing costs. In reality, it was a siphon, and the contact email on the LLC registration traced directly back to one used by Brad Coleman years ago. Jackson read the report twice, each line like a nail in a coffin. It wasn't just corruption. It was architecture. Someone had built a system within the system, invisible to anyone who didn't look close enough. He stared out the window of his office, watching the city blur in the morning rain. The store still looked ordinary from the outside. Customers were still paying, staff were still clocking in, but now he knew. Every smile was covering something. Every tip was a transaction in a much larger game. And if Brad Coleman thought marking people as supplemental staff could erase them, he was about to learn the opposite. Jackson set the report down, his voice calm but sharp as he called Mara again. "Keep tracking. No alerts. Not yet. I want them to believe nothing's changed." He hung up, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes for a moment. Some truths didn't show up in spreadsheets. They hid in plain sight, settling quietly in a chipped cup, a lost paycheck, or a cashier's silent tears. But once uncovered, they couldn't be buried again. 3 days later, Jackson Cole walked back into Branch 17, not in a hoodie this time, not with the weary shuffle of a traveler. Today, he wore a dark suit and carried himself with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed to hide. The bell above the door jingled just as it had before, but this time the room reacted differently. Conversations slowed. A few heads turned. The cashier, the same young woman who had placed her notebook in his hands, froze for half a second before catching herself and sliding a tray toward a customer. Jackson didn't sit in the corner booth. He walked straight to the counter. The manager, Brad Coleman, stood behind it, his usual polished grin plastered across his face. "Good morning, sir. Can I help you?" His tone carried the same easy confidence of someone who believed he controlled the ground he stood on. Jackson placed a slim folder on the counter. Inside, pages of audit logs, screenshots, payroll anomalies, and the notebook the cashier had risked to create. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You rerouted the system," Jackson said, steady and calm. "Every digital tip, Every role assignment, all of it flows through accounts you control. The smile faltered, just slightly. Brad chuckled, glancing at the other staff as if to dismiss the accusation. I think you must be mistaken. Our system is transparent. Jackson cut him off, sliding the top page forward. The audit showed Tyler C's account collecting 67% of all tips while covering less than 15% of tables. This isn't transparency. This is theft disguised as configuration. A hush spread across the floor. Employees who had pretended not to notice were suddenly listening. Customers waiting in line leaned in, sensing something unusual was happening. Brad's voice sharpened. Who exactly are you to question how I run my branch? Jackson met his eyes, then slowly pulled a black business card from his pocket. The silver lettering caught the light. Jackson Cole, founder and CEO, Horizon Retail Group. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. The cashier's hand paused mid-motion. One of the servers standing near the pause stepped back as if the floor had shifted under him. Brad's face drained of color. You're the owner, Jackson finished for him. His tone never rose, but each word landed like a hammer. I built this company so that people like her, he gestured toward the cashier, could work with dignity, not so families could carve out backroom privileges. He opened the folder wider, revealing the shell company registration, the duplicated social security number, the false payroll account. Each piece was damning on its own. Together, they painted a system of manipulation too precise to be coincidence. The cashier finally looked up, eyes wide. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just stood straighter, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Brad tried one last line of defense, voice cracking. It's not what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like, Jackson said flatly. And it ends today. For the first time, the staff saw Brad not as their manager, but as a man exposed. The power he carried had evaporated in the span of a few sentences, and standing across from him wasn't just a customer, it was the one man he couldn't dismiss. Jackson didn't need applause. He didn't need anyone to cheer. The silence in the room was enough, because in that silence, justice had already spoken louder than words. The folder stayed on the counter like a verdict. Brad didn't touch it. He couldn't. Every line inside was a nail sealing his position shut. The employees who once looked at him with forced respect now avoided his eyes. The customers who had been waiting in line whispered under their breath, some lifting their phones to record. Jackson didn't raise his voice. He simply pulled out his phone and pressed a number. Seconds later, Mara's voice echoed clearly on speaker. This is internal audit for Horizon Retail. Effective immediately, Brad Coleman is suspended from all duties pending termination. Payroll access is revoked. Role permissions reset. Compliance is en route. The room froze. It wasn't just a statement, it was a dismantling. In real time, the system Brad had controlled was being stripped from his hands. The cashier stood at the register, uncertain. Jackson looked at her directly, calm and steady. Try it now, he said. Her hands trembled slightly as she tapped the screen. For the first time, her name appeared under the active user role. The next customer added a tip to their card. She held her breath as the receipt printed. The tip amount displayed correctly. No reroute, no redirection. It was hers. Her shoulders dropped, relief flooding her face. A small smile appeared, not of victory, but of validation. Across the floor, Tyler and Marcus exchanged nervous glances. Whatever power they thought they had evaporated the second their access vanished. Without Brad shielding them, they were just employees again, accountable like everyone else. Jackson closed his phone, his words quiet but unmistakable. This store is no longer a place where people disappear. From now on, every dollar, every effort, every person will be seen. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't need thanks. The justice wasn't in the spectacle, it was in the system being corrected. And as he turned toward the door, the cashier whispered softly, almost to herself, finally. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she wasn't invisible. When Jackson stepped outside, the drizzle had eased into a light mist. The air smelled of damp concrete and coffee grounds, but inside him, the weight was heavier than the weather. He hadn't come here for revenge. He hadn't come to humiliate a manager in front of customers. He had come for something simpler, something harder to measure truth, and the truth had been exposed. As his shoes tapped against the wet pavement, Jackson thought back to the notebook the cashier had handed him. Pages of small handwriting, shaky at times, pressed with frustration, fear, and the kind of persistence that comes only from being ignored for too long. She had documented what no one else would. That little book, dismissed by some as scribbles, had carried more honesty than all of Brad's monthly reports combined. Jackson's voice, steady and low, lingered as if speaking to the store, to the company, to anyone willing to listen. A business can survive a bad quarter. It can survive a slow season, but it cannot survive when its best people believe they don't matter. Dignity is not optional. It is the foundation. Back inside, the staff moved differently. The cashier greeted customers with a steadier tone, her shoulders no longer bent under invisible weight. A trainee who had stayed quiet until now offered to help her, almost shyly, like a small act of solidarity. The entire atmosphere had shifted, not because the decor changed, not because sales spiked, but because fairness had been restored. Customers might never know what had happened that morning. They'd just sense it in the energy of the place. But for the employees, it was more than a shift in mood. It was a line in the sand. Jackson paused before getting into his car, looking back through the glass. The neon sign still buzzed faintly, but now it didn't feel tired. It felt like a beacon, a reminder that even the most ordinary storefront could hold extraordinary lessons about power, greed, and integrity. He took a breath and spoke one last sentence, not to the manager he had removed, not to the staff who had witnessed everything, but to the unseen audience beyond. Fairness isn't a gift, it's a responsibility, and if we don't defend it in the small places, we lose it everywhere. With that, he slid into his car and pulled away. The camera of memory stayed behind on the cashier, her hand steady on the register, the faintest smile breaking across her face. She wasn't invisible anymore, and for Jackson, that was enough. By the end of that week, Branch 17 looked the same on the outside. Same neon sign, same parking lot, same chipped counter, but inside, it had changed in ways that mattered. The cashier, the young woman who had risked putting her pain into a notebook, was no longer just another invisible worker. Jackson promoted her into a trainer role, tasked with teaching new hires not just how to process transactions, but how to recognize when something doesn't feel right. Her key at persistence had become policy. Brad Coleman's name was scrubbed from the system within hours of his suspension. Tyler and Marcus, stripped of their privileges, were reassigned pending review. For years, they had enjoyed the kind of protection that came from proximity to power. Now, that power was gone. But Jackson wasn't finished. What he had uncovered at Branch 17 wasn't an isolated trick. It was a template, a way of hiding theft behind technical jargon, shifting access roles, and creating supplemental staff categories to make real people disappear. If it had happened here, it could be happening elsewhere. He ordered a full audit of every branch under Horizon Retail. Quietly, without announcement, hundreds of POS logs were examined, payroll files cross-checked, shell companies flagged. The findings were unsettling. In 6 other locations, similar patterns emerged. Duplicate social security numbers, unexplained service fees, tips rerouted into shadow accounts. It wasn't just a rogue manager. It was a culture problem, a willingness to look away when numbers added up, but people broke down. Jackson addressed his executive team with the same steady voice he had used at the counter that morning. We don't fix this with one firing. We fix this with accountability. Every store, every shift, every employee. Within 2 weeks, Horizon rolled out a new policy. All employees would have direct access to their tip records through a mobile app updated in real time. No manager could alter or redirect. Every customer receipt now printed with a line showing exactly where the tip went. Transparency wasn't optional anymore. It was built into the system. The shift was immediate. Complaints dropped. Morale rose. And in places where silence had once been the only survival strategy, employees began to speak again. Jackson didn't celebrate. He didn't hold a press conference. Quietly, he visited the cashier again on a rainy Thursday morning. She was training 2 new hires, pointing out the features on the updated POS screen. Her voice was steady, her posture confident. When she noticed him, she simply nodded a silent acknowledgement, not of hierarchy, but of shared truth. Jackson left without interrupting. For him, the victory wasn't in headlines or applause. It was in the ordinary rhythm of a store finally running the way it was supposed to. Honest, transparent, fair, because fairness wasn't just about big deals or billion-dollar acquisitions. It was about the smallest transactions, the ones that seemed too minor to notice. And if an empire could be saved by a notebook and a cashier's quiet courage, maybe it was never about the empire at all. 2 weeks later, Jackson returned to Branch 17 one last time. This time, he wasn't undercover. He wasn't carrying folders or audit logs. He came alone. No cameras, no entourage. The neon sign glowed against the early morning fog, just as it had on that first day. But something in the air was different. The exhaustion was gone. The silence had been replaced by an easy rhythm of greetings, the kind of tone you couldn't fake. Inside, the cashier stood at the register, not with tears in her eyes, but with calm authority. She was showing a trainee how to print a receipt, how to confirm the tip line, how to explain it to customers so that transparency became second nature. When she noticed Jackson, she didn't flinch. She didn't freeze like before. Instead, she offered a genuine smile, not because of who he was, but because of what had changed. "You came back," she said softly. Jackson nodded. "I had to. You started this." She glanced down, almost embarrassed. "All I did was write it down." "That's more than most people ever do," Jackson replied. "You didn't just write numbers, you wrote proof, and that proof forced us to look at what we didn't want to see." The trainee stepped aside, sensing the moment wasn't for him. Customers waited patiently in line, but no one complained. For a brief second, the entire store seemed to pause. Jackson placed a small envelope on the counter. "Back pay," he said simply. "Everything that was taken. Every dollar accounted for." Her eyes widened. She didn't touch the envelope right away, almost afraid it might vanish if she did. When she finally opened it, her breath caught. Inside wasn't just the money she had lost. It was a handwritten note from Jackson himself. "Fairness is not charity, it's the baseline. Thank you for reminding us." For the first time since he had walked into that store undercover, Jackson saw her truly smile. Not out of relief, not out of defiance, but out of being seen. As he turned to leave, she called after him. "Why me? Why did you notice?" He paused at the door, looking back. His voice was steady, the same tone he used when speaking to boards and shareholders. "Because the health of a company is written on the faces of the people who think no one's watching, and I was watching." He pushed the door open, stepping into the mist, leaving behind the hum of a store finally running the way it should. For the staff, the day went on as normal. Receipts printed, tips tracked correctly, shifts rotated. But for Jackson, the story had closed its circle. What began with a whispered confession, "The ones who do the work don't get the tips," had ended with a store where every effort was acknowledged, every dollar accounted for, every person visible. And for the audience listening now, the message was simple, but it carried weight. A business isn't defined by marble floors or quarterly profits. It's defined by whether dignity survives in the smallest corners. Lose that, and you lose everything. Protect it, and you protect everyone. The drizzle thickened into rain as Jackson walked toward his car. He didn't look back this time. He didn't need to, because behind him, inside Branch 17, fairness was no longer just an idea. It was practice. It was policy. It was lived. And for the first time in a long time, a cashier's smile was proof enough that justice had been done.